Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura's Handmade Haven. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. We're going to be kicking off our Let's Bake Quilt Sew Along. This is a quilt that Lori Holt designed and did a sew along for in 2018. I have not made this quilt before, so some of you may have already made it, and thank goodness. I hope that you offer some advice as we move along. If you haven't made it, I hope you join me in making this quilt. So we're going to start with making our blocks on July 8th. You're obviously going to have to gather some things before then if you want to sew along with me. So I thought I would give you the quick rundown of some supplies and kind of like my basic idea of how I'm going to tackle this project. So let's talk about supplies first. Obviously, you're going to need fabric and you're going to need some interfacing if you use the Lori Holt interfacing method for your applique. You're also going to need a sewing machine and thread and a cutting mat. But you're also probably going to want some organizational tools, and that's where I can help you out. So first thing first, what I have done, and you can find this in the description box down below, I have started to put together a cheat sheet per se for our sew along. And a couple of the things you're going to find in there are some labels. So just like when we did the Be Happy quilt and the Sweetland quilt, I've gone through the sew along guide and I've broken down the blocks and I've put together some organizational labels for you. So if you're going to pre-cut all of your fabric in advance, then you can label those little baggies or your clips or whatever you're using to keep your pieces together. If you're going to do like I'm going to do and cut as we go, then you're still going to want those little labels because you may want to pin those onto your blocks as we move through the quilt, just until you get to the point where you can start assembling some blocks together. The other thing you're going to find in that organizational packet is the block background fabric cutting guide. This breaks down all of the blocks in the quilt. It tells you how many of each size and what they're going to be doing in the quilt. So this is actually over a page long, but I don't like to read small fonts, so I figured you don't either. So I just went ahead and let that go across 2 pages for us. Now, as we move through this quilt, I will be updating that document each week with the Sew Simple shapes that you need, any bias tape you need, anything like that, because obviously I'm going to be quilting a little in advance from you. And so I'm going to go through there and double check all of my Sew Simple shapes, all of the measurements, all of that good stuff, and put all of it together in that one sheet for you. And that sheet will just update automatically probably halfway through the week to prepare you for that next week. So all of the videos are going to be posting on Tuesdays starting July 8th. So the cutting for that first week will probably post somewhere around the 5th. And then moving forward, I'll post it probably 3 or 4 days in advance of that Tuesday video. So that way, if you want to cut out your pieces in advance of that weekly video, then you can go ahead and get that done and you'll be able to sew along right along with me. Let's talk about the other supplies you're going to need for this quilt. You're going to need to go and get yourself a Sew Simple Shape Set E, and that is for the Let's Bake quilt. So go find those. I found some on Amazon, so they are definitely available. Check your local quilt shops as well, because obviously we want to support our local quilt shops. Now, in addition to Set E, if you want to make the quilt just like I'm going to be making it, you're also going to want to make sure you get Sew Simple Shape Set I, because I'm going to be using a few of those shapes to replace some of those stitched flowers, because my hand is not going to let me make 34 of those hand stitched flowers. So instead, I'm going to do some applique for those blocks. So if you want to make the quilt just like you're going to see me make it, you're also going to need Sew Simple Shape Set I. All right, so in addition to fabric and sewing machine and needles and threads and cutting mat and rotary blade, you're also going to want some interfacing. Now, you can obviously go and get the Lori Holt interfacing. Look at the sew along guide. It may tell you how much to get. I didn't check that out because that's just not what I'm using. I'm going to be using Pellon 30. It's actually a stabilizer, not an interfacing, but I've used this on a lot of her quilts and it works really well. I like the weight. I like the way it handles in my quilt, and I like the way it quilts when I go to long arm it. So that's what I'm going to be using as Pellon 30. Now, as far as fabric, I have not seen any Let's Bake quilt sets anymore. So what I'm going to be using is a bunch of scraps. Now, I actually have some yardage from the Hometown collection, so I'm going to be using that. I also have some leftover scraps from, I think it's Bee Vintage, so I'm going to be using those scraps. And then I have some of the white bee backgrounds that I'm going to be using those throughout my quilt as well. I'm basically going to be cutting as I go. So each week I'm going to be cutting what I need for those applique blocks and making those blocks each week. So I'm not cutting all my fabric in advance, which is a little different than what I've done with the Sweetland quilt. So just, it's just a different way to do it. And it's just mostly because I'm using scraps and I don't want to have to match which fabric is going to replace which fabric in the sew along guide. Because like I said, some of these are scraps and I may not have enough to be consistent throughout the entire quilt. So I'm just going to try to match colors as closely as I can, unless it's something that I want to totally customize, like the stove, for instance. So you're going to see a lot of different modifications and changes in my quilt than from the original sample quilt that she put together 7 years ago. So our sew along is going to take us all the way almost to the end of September, just in time for that beehive quilt to begin that she's going to be hosting this fall. So if you're interested in doing the Let's Bake quilt, we will be done before her sew along this fall begins. Now the Jane Austen quilt does begin this summer, but it's a block of the month. And so it's not going to be as strenuous as her weekly sew alongs. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Okay, so if you've watched my other sew-alongs, I love my project totes, and this is what I'm going to be using again. I'll probably be storing all of my fabrics in here, all the scraps, and then I'm also going to be storing the blocks as I have them made. If everything doesn't fit up on my design wall, then I'll start storing them until I can put things together. And then also the border blocks, those stitched flowers around the border in the quilt, those have a bunch of 2.5-inch strips. So all of those 2.5-inch strips for my border and the 2.5-inch strips for the inner and outer border will also be stored in a project box until I get to them. So let's talk about what I am going to be doing in advance for the entire quilt before I get started with my first applique block. Now, as I mentioned, I am going to be cutting all the fabrics for the applique pieces as I go along. I'm just going to be pulling out what I like and putting them together and appliquing as I go. But I am going to go ahead and cut out all of my background fabrics before I even get started. So that's where those project boxes are going to come in handy as well. And that's where my organization labels are going to come in handy. So I can just label those background fabrics as I cut them with where they are going to be in the quilt and what block they're going to be making for me. Now, if you look at the sew along guide put out by Riley Blake, you're going to notice a little discrepancy between their measurements and my measurements in the sew along guide that I'm providing in the description box down below. And the reason for that is because at the time that they put the sew along guide out, they did not give you any wiggle room. And what I mean by that is in the sew along guide from them, if you had an 8.5 by 10.5 inch block in the quilt, they had you cut that background fabric at 8.5 by 10.5. Now, if you've done many of Lori Holt's quilts lately, you'll know that she has you cut those background fabrics a little bigger. And that's because when you applique, sometimes that fabric tends to draw up or shrink a little bit. And if you don't give yourself a little wiggle room, then you're going to be in trouble when you go to try to assemble your quilt top, because your blocks aren't going to line up as perfectly as they could have if you would have just given yourself a little extra fabric to begin with. So when you look at the block background fabric cutting guide, you're going to notice that I have upped all of the numbers on how I'm going to cut for the block. For instance, the stitched flowers are a 4.5-inch square. I'm going to have you cut your backgrounds at 6 inches. That way, after we've done our applique on that, we can trim it down to 4.5 inches and it will fit perfectly in our quilt. And that's just going to help us out in the long run. And it's not that much fabric that we're wasting, and it's going to help alleviate a lot of stress and anxiety, and I am always for that. Okay, so a couple other tools you may want to gather if you haven't done any of her quilts before. You're going to want to try to find yourself a Clover 2-point turner. And this is just a tool that we're going to use when we're turning those applique shapes, just to get the little points out, to get those edges smooth, and to make sure our shapes look really good for applique. A couple other things that I use, obviously, we're going to need a seam ripper because, well, sometimes we make mistakes. And this is actually a double-ended tool. I have a seam ripper on one end and a stiletto on the other. You may hear me call it a stylus because sometimes my brain does not work. I also like a mechanical pencil, and that's for tracing all of my Sew Simple shapes onto the interfacing and for labeling them as I go along. And then you may want to find yourself a purple thing. I don't use this often, but sometimes I do, and it is... The only other item that you're going to need is just your fabric scissors, and you may want a pair of the small fabric scissors as well with a little pointy point on them. Those are really helpful to cut through that interfacing before you turn your shapes out. So I think that is all the supplies you're going to want. It's up to you when you applique if you want to use thread that matches your fabric or if you want to choose one color and applique the entire quilt with it. I haven't made the decision on that yet, so I can't share with you what I'm doing. I know the last couple of applique quilts I've done, I just went ahead and used just one color throughout the entire thing. I really like the way they turn out, and I may do that again. I just haven't made a final decision on that, so I don't want to tell you something and then it not be accurate later on. So let me put the schedule up here for you. I hope that you're as excited about this as I am. I am really excited to be able to make this Let's Bake quilt. It's been on my list for a while. I really love the quilt. The thing that's made me hesitate making it is all of those stitched flowers and all the hand stitching that goes into this quilt. And there's still some hand stitching we're going to be doing in this quilt. But I'm definitely minimizing the amount of that and I'm replacing it with other things, and it's still going to be adorable and I'm going to love it just as much. So I'm excited to get this done. The quilt, I believe, finishes right around 70 inches, so it's going to be perfect for hanging in my living room, and I am just really excited to be able to do this with you guys. I know that in my June Handmade Happenings, I gave you guys some choices and said, what do you think? What should we do? And so many of you came back and said you would love to see me do the Let's Bake quilt. And so that's where we're at. That's what we're doing. And I'm excited to get started. And I hope you are too. I hope that I will be able to share all kinds of tips and tricks with you. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the appropriate videos as we move along. If you have any general comments or questions, please leave them on this video. I definitely get back to all of those. And I look forward to hearing from you guys soon. So until next time, gather up your supplies and find joy in all you do. Carve out some time for crafting and creating. And remember, it's always better when you make stuff up.